What is terrorism and who defines it?
Right, that's a brilliant question.
Who is a terrorist and according to who?
When you read the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, they define a terrorist as somebody that goes around terrorizing people, utilizing violence in order for political gains. And that definition will be tried and tested by the United Nations Security Council. That's what it says.
It's a person who does what? Uses violence to terrorize other people for political gain.
Yes.
We know who's the biggest country that does that.
100%. Now they're saying, once we've identified somebody as a terrorist, we want you to close their account, whether there is evidence or not,
as long as we say it.
Perpetuated terrorism. And remember, this definition is being given by a nation where white men eliminated 50 million American Indians to then create a white world where they wiped out the natives of that land. And it's a terrorist country that terrorized American Indians and continues to terrorize American Indians, giving us a definition of what it is that is a terrorist. The first country to come up with nuclear weapons was America, followed by Russia. Any other time that that technology was sent through to other countries or was acquired by other countries is considered as proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the non-proliferation treaties existed by the time that America was giving technology for the manufacturing of nuclear weapons to the South African government, to Israel, which gave it to the South African government, to France, which gave it to Israel, which gave it to the South African government. That was proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. When it was done by the Americans, it was not considered to be funding of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But now that all the Western countries have got weapons of mass destruction to defend themselves, the moment that Russia tries to give that technology to Iran, the moment China tries to give that technology to North Korea, all of a sudden, it is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which must be punished and criminalized as a crime by the Financial Action Task Force and all financial institutions. So what they're saying is the moment that non-white nations want to learn how to have nuclear weapons and want to get that technology from the countries that have it, those countries are criminal. Their proceeds and monies to fund those activities shall be criminalized, considered as money laundering, and considered as funding terrorism and funding the proliferation. So it's basically they don't want us to compete.
Welcome to Wake Up Blaq. Educate and enlighten.
What's money laundering to a normal person?
So money laundering is when money is earned illegitimately. Through an illegitimate activity that is usually defined as a predicate crime.
Yeah.
And that predicate crime earns profits, but these profits must be spent. So they must go into the normal financial system. So the laundering of that money is cleaning up that money. So you either start a nightclub, you start a legitimate business, the legitimate business invoices, the money that is invoiced is banked, and part of what is invoiced is the money from these proceeds of this illegal activity that are then brought into the financial system. So that act of making this dirty money, clean money through a legitimate activity is actually what is called money laundering. Then it goes into the system and people can enjoy the proceeds.
You're making me wonder how much money is being laundered in the crypto space.
Before I even talk about the crypto space, we need to understand that apartheid, colonialism were all crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
So the control of people, the control of their land, control of their resources, control of their minerals was all a crime. That is accepted.
Yeah.
Apartheid was actually called a crime against humanity. So was colonialism. And laws have been made against them. And we've got so-called legitimate companies that continue to control human labor, the resources that they stole during colonialism and slavery, and the minerals that they stole during colonialism and slavery. They continue to enslave people to work in these mines. Anglo-America does it. Glencore does it. And even now, Glencore has even gone and started bribing governments all across the world. They even start wars. That money that they earn, these legitimate profits that they earn, are illegitimate.
Yeah.
And the way that they are brought into the banking system, the way that they have shares and the way that they give profits and dividends, that is actually money laundering.
Jeez.
If the tables were turned around, if what is happening with Anglo-America was happening in Europe, and if Anglo-America was African, they would be calling the proceeds of all these multinational companies, all these blue chip companies, all the companies sitting on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, their proceeds would be called money laundering proceeds, and those monies would be blocked.
I disrupted you. 1996, they include
right.
money laundering.
1996, they include money laundering.
Yeah.
2001, we have the World Trade Center bombings.
Yeah.
Immediately a month later in October, they then create new laws that now incorporate terrorism. Now, when you hear all these things I'm saying...
By new laws, you're talking in the financial system.
Yes, in the financial system.
You're not speaking defense. You're speaking...
In the financial system.
In particular with finance.
With the Financial Action Task Force.
Yeah.
But a secret as to why that was done is then told by a guy who worked in the US Treasury. A guy by the name of Juan Zaret. Juan Zaret says, I was one of the treasury directors, and my responsibility was a treasurer director for counterterrorism in the United States Treasury. And so once we had 9/11, which many people say was done by the Americans themselves,
that's then a conspiracy.
It's said to be a conspiracy. Okay. So we leave that one.
Sure.
But what is interesting is Juan Zaret says a month later, they sat as the US Treasury and they decided that they were going to put pressure on the Financial Action Task Force created by the G7 that had these 22 members to create new laws on controlling the movement of money, the funding of terrorism, money laundering, so that they could control the banking systems of the world.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking of the examples you made with apartheid and colonization. And I'm thinking of the convenience. So drug trade, 1989, 1990. Money laundering, because these people don't need to move drugs, they just move money. But if we can link them to drugs. Now, years later, 2001, looking at some of these nations, the G7s, and some of the nations they have bombed, and some of the atrocities they've caused, conveniently now, because a building is bombed there, let's get the whole world to buy into this thing.
And remember, 9/11 allows them to create these rules, which a treasury director, an American, admits that we took advantage of 9/11 to create laws into the Financial Action Task Force that we were going to internationalize. So what we were going to do is we were going to say that every single financial system in the world is either with the Americans or against the Americans. When we say these people are terrorists, then we need to make sure that if we say that we are closing their accounts, every other banking system in the world must close their banking accounts.
Of those 22 nations.
Because what they did is when they created these 40 recommendations as the Financial Action Task Force, they gave it to all banks across the world. And then they said to all banks across the world, you have to implement these recommendations in your countries. You've got to make laws within your countries. You've got to create institutions like financial intelligence units in your countries. And you've got to implement these 40 recommendations, and the World Bank and the IMF will come and supervise and measure and do what I call peer reviews and assessments to see whether your banks are implementing this. And if your banks are not implementing this, then you are contaminating the international financial system. And by so doing, then we have to isolate you and your financial system from our financial system. This brings us to where South Africa is now with this threat of grey listing. What they're saying is South Africa has been compared with these 40 recommendations. And it seems South Africa is not implementing these 40 recommendations. They say, number one, South Africa is not creating enough institutions and enough investigating capacity and enough laws to stop money laundering, to stop funding of terrorism. And remember, they then added what is called the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. South Africa is not stopping these three. They've got too much organized crime in South Africa. Their police force and their investigative wings are not able to investigate and adequately catch People who are corrupt, people who are in organized crime, and people who are drug trafficking and doing any other crimes that could be bringing money laundered funds into the banking system. They're saying that South Africa trades too much in cash. The South African economy, according to one of the regulations, recommendations within the 40, is that nations should not allow too many cash transactions, because every transaction that is done should be monitored.
Yeah.
We must know who's moving money. That's why I want people to have bank accounts. But a lot of people are unbankable in South Africa, which goes to show you that these Financial Action Task Force recommendations are divorced from the realities of South Africa. So they're saying South Africa's got too many cash transactions, and a lot of cash is leaving South Africa, out of the borders of South Africa, into neighboring countries, into other African countries. And we believe that that could be funding terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
I want to ask a sneaky question. What is terrorism and who defines it?
Right, that's a brilliant question.
Who is a terrorist, and according to who?
When you read the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, they define a terrorist as somebody that goes around terrorizing people, utilizing violence in order for political gains. And that definition will be tried and tested by the United Nations Security Council. That's what it says.
It's a person who does what? Uses violence to terrorize other people for political gain.
Yes.
We know who's the biggest country that does that.
100%.
Please continue.
But now the Financial Action Task Force tried to be clever. They use the definition that a designated person is a terrorist is that person that has been designated as a terrorist by the UN Security Council. But they use that selectively throughout the document. So that in certain areas, as we said, that American influence by the US Treasury in 1990, in 2001, after 9/11, deliberately wanted to ensure that America's definition of a terrorist is what is also combined with what it is that the UN defines. So now the Americans are saying, when we say somebody is a terrorist, we expect the G7 nations to back us up and the Financial Action Task Force to back us up. And those recommendations that are forcing third-party countries to implement the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force to also identify what America identifies as a terrorist, and for you to block them. Now they're saying, once we've identified somebody as a terrorist, we want you to close their account, whether there is evidence or not,
as long as we say
perpetuated terrorism.
So we watch a lot of Hollywood movies, and I think we agree that Hollywood has become one of the most powerful propaganda machines for America and maybe the CIA. When we think terrorists today, we think of an Arab man who is Muslim. And I'm just trying to think, for a normal person that's going to be listening to this conversation, can a white man be a terrorist? Can a white woman be a terrorist? Because clearly, if someone's going to say that's a terrorist, like, it can't be, doesn't look. And that becomes profiling. And that, of course, because of the movies, it's been playing in our heads that a terrorist can only look this way. It's like a criminal. When someone says, oh, but he doesn't look like a criminal. You're like, oh, he's not black. He's not wearing a hoodie. He doesn't speak broken English. It's a clean, white woman, polished. Can't be her. That's very dangerous. And when we start saying white male America gets to define what is a terrorist, because it will never be a white man.
And remember, this definition has been given by a nation where white men eliminated 50 million American Indians to then create a white world where they wiped out the natives of that land. And it's a terrorist country that terrorized American Indians and continues to terrorize American Indians, giving us a definition of what it is that is a terrorist. And that is intentional. Like we are showing you right now that the Financial Action Task Force is now being manipulated from having a total definition of a terrorist being given by the United Nations to now having a terrorist being defined by the Americans, not only in their policies, but also in their subliminal influence of our judges, our lawyers, and everybody who's going to be part and parcel of this process between now in November and January next year of making laws for South Africa that's going to define the new regulations that South Africa has to make in order to conform to the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. And the Financial Action Task Force is saying another problem is South Africa has not been identifying violent crime in South Africa adequately as terrorism. And they believe that some of the drug crime that you've got in Western Cape, some of the taxi violence that you've got in this country, some of the violent crimes that you've got in this country should be adequately defined as terrorism and should be designated as terrorism. And the people that are perpetrating these crimes should be designated as terrorists, and their funds should be blocked accordingly. And therefore, they should have their properties confiscated. Now, that again confuses me, because the definition of a terrorist should be done at the UN. But the Financial Action Task Force is asking South Africa and the South African Parliament, the South African government, to make legislation that criminalizes any violent crime and categorizes it as terrorism. And those funds should be treated as money laundering and terrorism, and also potentially the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Now, before we go, remember that the first country to come up with nuclear weapons was America, followed by Russia. Any other time that technology was sent through to other countries or was acquired by other countries is considered as proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the non-proliferation treaties existed by the time that America was giving technology for the manufacturing of nuclear weapons to the South African government, to Israel, which gave it to the South African government, to France, which gave it to Israel, and which gave it to the South African government. That was proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. When it was done by the Americans, it was not considered to be funding of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But now that all the Western countries have got weapons of mass destruction to defend themselves, the moment that Russia tries to give that technology to Iran, the moment China tries to give that technology to North Korea, all of a sudden, it is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which must be punished and criminalized as a crime by the Financial Action Task Force and all financial institutions. So what they're saying is the moment that non-white nations want to learn how to have nuclear weapons and want to get that technology from the countries that have it, those countries are criminal. Their proceeds and monies to fund those activities shall be criminalized, considered as money laundering, and considered as funding terrorism and funding the proliferation. So it's basically they don't want us to compete. It's the same reason that they have these money laundering laws. Now that Africans are all over the continent, they're all over the world. They've become millionaires and multimillionaires in America. They've become multimillionaires in Europe. The moment they want to take their proceeds and send it back to Africa to develop Africa, they want to send those savings back to Africa for Africa to create banking systems and banking institutions that can help to develop Africa. Those monies can be designated or controlled by financial action rules and regulations that are there to stop money laundering, but in actual fact, they're there to stop the development of Africa.
You know,